Good morning or afternoon, wherever you may be joining us from today. My name is Charity Counts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Midwest Museums. AMM is located in Indianapolis, Indiana, the ancestral homelands of the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, Shawnee, Wee, and Kickapoo communities. I'm joining you today from my home office in Fishers. Welcome. My office has blue walls and white doors. Behind me is a painting of a woman holding her head in her hand. I'm a fair-skinned white woman with dark shoulder-length hair and dark eyes, and today I'm wearing another one of my Proud Museum Person t-shirts and a blazer. Thank you for joining us for the second in a series of Lunchtime Leadership Chats this month as a part of the Mutual of America Museum Leadership Series. We're grateful for the support and thought leadership of our friends at Mutual of America, three of whom are here with us today, whose support has made it possible for us to gather virtually and discuss some pressing issues for museums in the region, particularly for museum leaders. I invite everyone to unmute for a moment to join me in a round of applause to thank Mutual of America. Thank you. Woo. This session is hosted in Zoom meeting so that you can join us in a conversation at a point, I guess at any point in a manner that's comfortable for you. For those of you who wish to join us only in the chat and exchange comments or questions there, that's perfectly fine. If you wish to unmute or show your video to ask questions or join the conversation at any point, you're welcome to do that. I ask that if you do want to unmute and participate via audio or video, that you raise your hand using the reactions tool at the bottom of your screen. You can click raise hand and it tells me that the host to invite you to unmute and share. We have enabled Zoom's live transcription feature today. To turn this on or off, click the CC button in the menu at the bottom of your screen. We also have an ASL interpreter with us today. Zoom allows each participant to control where you see your ASL interpreter on the screen, although I do have her spotlit today along with our speakers. So hopefully the five of us stay on screen at all times for you. But if not, you can always pin the interpreter to the top of your screen. We are also recording today's chat to be able to share it with participants who could not join us live, and to also help us compile key takeaways that we'll be able to make available in a toolkit after the series is completed. The focus of today's chat is planning for retirement. And joining me are three representatives from Mutual of America who spend their day-to-day speaking with folks like us at nonprofits and other types of organizations across the region about retirement and investment planning. Sara, Marissa, and Todd, will you introduce yourselves? Just tell us who you are, where you're located, and what you do at Mutual of America.
Thanks, Charity. Hi, everybody. I am Sara Wiencken, located in Indianapolis, Indiana today, but also sometimes located in our office in Covington, Kentucky. And I am a vice president here at Mutual of America, responsible for our operations across the states of Indiana and Kentucky. Really excited to be here with all of you today.
Marissa?
I am Marissa Halchak, and I'm a regional financial consultant for Mutual of America, and I cover the Mid-Central region. So I am based here in Nashville. That is where I live. I cover the Nashville office. I also cover the Atlanta office, the St. Louis office, Pittsburgh, Akron, and where Sara is, depending on whether it's Indianapolis or Covington. So I cover all of those areas, and I do the financial planning for our plan participants. And I'm so glad to be here. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Marissa. Todd.
Thank you, Charity. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Todd Dixon. I am the Senior Regional Vice President of our Chicago office. We do filter into Northwest Indiana. I've been with Mutual of America going on my 12th year now, and about 15 years in the industry. So looking forward to a great discussion, and thanks for having us today.
Great. Thank you all for being here. Now that we've introduced ourselves, and again, I wanted to open it up for those who are joining us today for this chat, listening in or participating. Feel free to tell us where you're from in the chat yourself. We'd love to hear where you come from today. But for now, we're going to go ahead and start into our discussion. So the way we've structured today's session is really talk show style. So I've got some questions I'm going to be asking, and we welcome questions from all of you in the chat. So Sara, Marissa, Todd, we're really glad to have you here to share your insights and advice about retirement planning. Before we pick your brains over the next hour, I wanted to ask a general observation question. It could just be me, but I feel like I've been noticing more retirement announcements and more talk of retirement than usual this year, particularly in the museum profession. I watch our job board on the AMM website regularly, and we share announcements all of the time. So I feel like I'm seeing more of them. Is this something you're seeing across the nonprofit sector with clients you work with? And if you are, what factors do you feel are at play? Is it pandemic related?
I'll jump in if you don't mind, Charity. Certainly, yes. I think we've seen an uptick in the pre-retirement age group, a small uptick. That would be kind of the age 55 to 64, finally deciding it might be time to move out of their careers. But we've definitely seen a much larger increase in that age 64 to 74 age group. So the age group that could retire at any point, but maybe we're just waiting for the right opportunity to exit the job market. Factors at play for us in the discussions we're having, I think it's no secret that older workers have been more at risk through the pandemic with the coronavirus concerns. So I definitely think that's driving some of these retirement announcements we're facing right now. At the same time, home prices have risen, stock market values have risen, which are placing some owners of those assets in a better financial position to retire. And if anybody on the call here has a pension, you're probably aware or have seen there's been a significant increase in a lot of the lump sum values of those pension products due to the interest rate environment that we're in. So is it pandemic related? I would say it certainly seems to be driven by some of the things that have happened through the pandemic. It's really hard to know why everybody that's retiring is retiring right now, whether it's because of the rising wealth or, if we're seeing involuntary retirements due to job losses or businesses closing. On the nonprofit side, we have certainly seen a lot of our clients merging with other nonprofit organizations due to budget cuts and some things happening there as well. So it's been a very interesting time to watch, especially in the nonprofit sector, some of that movement and what's happening.
That's really interesting. Marissa or Todd, anything you wanted to add to that?
I would just echo Sarah's sentiments. It is something that we've seen an uptick in, and with the craziness of COVID, and there's a lot of uncertainty out there for people nearing retirement. Some of them just said, I've had enough. I'm going to get out of here while I'm certain of something. And so I think that is another thought process they go through of whether they're ready to retire early or not.
I think we've all faced some pandemic fatigue. So certainly those that are able to retire are saying, I think I'm ready to hang it up.
Yeah. Well, now I guess I'm a little curious about our participants today. I'm going to launch a quick poll to find out anonymously, of course, how many of you might be planning to retire in the near future. We're guessing that you have some plans or you're curious about it, but we don't know. So I'm going to launch this first poll here. And it's anonymous. So if you're listening and you have a moment to just respond, let us know, when do you plan to retire? Are you planning for that? Here we go. We'll give you about 30 seconds to look at the options here. It says, when do you plan to retire? Offers a few year options. And of course, if you don't have a time frame set yet, you can choose that option too. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll here and share the results. So it looks like, some people in the next 5 years, some not for another 20 years, and still a handful not yet sure about, a time frame for retirement. Great. Okay. So it's good. It's really interesting. Thanks. Okay. I'm thinking, and just after having a chance to chat with you all during planning, that it'd be good to run through some investing and retirement basics and terminology before we launch into, insights and some more specific information and questions from our participants today. Marissa, want to start us off with some terminology and general overview of retirement planning components, so people know what we're talking about when we talk about it today?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of this material may be something you're familiar with and some of it may not be, but we don't want to go into different topics and you have no idea what we're talking about. So just some things to talk about are, the terms 401k, 403b, 457. These are things you hear and it's just a lot of numbers and letters. Those numbers come from IRS codes, so they didn't just pull those out of a hat. But they are your employer-sponsored retirement plans, and depending on your employer is what decides what the plan is. So for example, a 403b would be for your nonprofit organizations, and 457 plans would be for those government organizations. There are also pensions, profit sharing plans. There is a whole list of them, but just to give you a couple of them for reference. And then you also have the terms deferrals, elections, company match. And these are things, if you are deferring from your salary, that means you're having money taken from your salary and put into these retirement saving plans. Elections would be what you're electing to invest in inside of these plans if you have that option. And your company may or may not have a match. So that's something you definitely want to be aware of if you're participating. That could be free money, essentially, that you're leaving on the table if you don't take advantage of the company matching what you're contributing. There's also terms such as IRA and Roth IRA, and these can be thrown around as traditional IRAs, rollover IRAs. But in general, IRAs are pre-tax money. You can use after-tax money and then look for a tax deduction. Roth IRAs are all after-tax money. And the difference there is when you pull money out of an IRA, whether you're going to pay taxes on it versus when you pull money out of a Roth IRA, when you're not going to pay taxes on it. And I know that this is a lot of information. So all of this can be found on some of our resources later on if you want to look into them in more detail. There are contribution limits for your plans. So the Roth IRAs, the traditional IRAs, the 401ks, etc. They all have contribution limits on what you can put inside of them each year. You want to be aware of beneficiaries that may be designated on your accounts. Should something happen to you, this is where the assets you have in those accounts would pass to someone you have designated. You want to make sure you check those often so that they are who you want to receive your money if something should happen to you. Some other terms, asset allocation. This is just something that describes how the investments inside your investment vehicles are proportioned, such as stocks, bonds, cash, fixed income. These all make up your asset allocation. And required minimum distributions. This is a term for a distribution you are required to take from your retirement plans at a certain age. Some people may be in that range where it's 70 and a half if you've already gotten to that age. The IRS recently changed that to age 72. And at that point in time, they use a couple different factors to determine how much you need to take out. You have to take that out, pay taxes on it. If you do not, you will get a penalty. So it's very important that you take that out when the IRS tells you to. So that is just a general overview. I don't want to overwhelm everyone, but there's a lot of terminology out there. I just want to give a little overview for everyone.
Great. Thanks, Marissa. You actually answered an offline question I received through the chat just about that very thing, the IRS mandated minimum. So thanks for touching on that.
Sure.
Okay, so here's a question for all of you. I'm curious what the typical questions are that people tend to ask themselves or their providers as they think about retirement, or that they should be asking themselves.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on this one too, just because I do a lot of the financial planning for our plan participants and their spouses and their families. But some of the things, whether you would be talking to me or another financial advisor or financial planner, some things you want to know ahead of time that they should be able to help you with are checking into your budget and your spending habits. That is a big component of your retirement planning. If you don't have your budget figured out, you're not going to be able to look for a path on what you can spend in retirement. Another thing you want to check with them on is an emergency fund. This is a very important piece that everyone should have. I think over the past year and a half or however long we've been dealing with the pandemic makes it more important now than ever, with people who have been furloughed or laid off or lost their job completely. Having an emergency fund set aside so that you'd be able to cover your living expenses for a few months is vitally important. Another thing you would want to ask about is short-term and long-term goals. Part of planning for retirement is setting goals that you'd like to achieve in retirement. There's got to be an end game you want to get to plan for. If you don't have those goals, you're not really sure where you're going. And the difference is some of them are short-term and some are long-term. So you may want to do some home renovations or buying a new house, buying a boat, or just some gifting to charities. And all of those, need to be determined whether it's going to be something in the short term or in the long term. And another important thing is risk tolerance. That will determine how your investments are allocated. So whether you're a little more conservative or more aggressive, your risk tolerance is individual, so it's different for every person. And finding that out is definitely important in order to get your investments the way they should be for you.
Those are some good questions to ask yourself. Sarah, Todd, anything you would want to add to that list, or did Marissa cover it well?
I agree. Yeah.
I think she did a great job.
Well, I know we've got lots of questions that will probably, shed some light in other areas. So we'll just keep moving along here. Next one kind of relates to a question I saw come through the chat. Where obviously people want to know how much do we save for retirement? And for this one, we thought we'd launch another poll of the audience here just to see, what you think. What do you think is the percentage of your current income that you will need in retirement to maintain your standard of living? And then we'll talk a little bit about what Sarah and Todd and Marissa see, in terms of what they would normally advise their clients to do. So let me launch this poll really fast here. So this is, again, your sort of income projection. What percentage of your current income do you think you will need in retirement to maintain your standard of living? And it's anonymous once again. So let's see what everybody says or thinks that they'll need. Couple more seconds here just to see. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll and share the results. So a lot of you said 80%, some 65%, 100%, 50%, and then others not sure. Totally fine, but everybody knows not all of us are, quite yet certain what we feel like we're going to need when we retire. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. So let's go back to our panel here then and chat a little bit about how much a person should be looking at. And also just while you're at it, I saw a question come into the chat just about, factors at play in terms of deciding what percentage you're going to need. I know some things you've mentioned already, Marissa, but I know that if some people don't have any retirement benefits coming to them from their employer, they might want to consider stuff like that. So, so how much should a person be planning to save?
I'll take that one. And Marissa mentioned it exactly spot on. You really want to start with the end in mind, right? You want to make sure you have a goal that you're going to reach, and then how do you get there? 80%, if not 100%, is the kind of rule of thumb, so to speak. Factors you want to take into account on how to get there, what you're going to need, really is your goals. If you plan on traveling or taking up hobbies now that you have more time that cost more money, well, then you maybe need to replace 110% of your income. But it really is going to come down to starting with point B and then backing into that number, right? Most of us have 3 sources of income when we do stop working. Social Security, which we know is not enough. Your retirement plans, IRAs, 457s, 401ks, 403bs, and then your own personal savings. Those 3 asset sources typically make up all of your income for most of us in retirement. So what your end goal or expenses look like is going to determine how much you need to be putting aside. Typically, it's about 12 to 15%. Numbers do show if you do about 12 to 15% your entire career, you're going to be able to replace about 80%, if not more, of your income when you stop working. I would say the key word there in that phrase is your entire career, right? Someone 21 years old may not need to do 10%. They may be able to do 8%. And these numbers do include any kind of employer piece as well. So it's not just your deferrals, something Marissa had mentioned earlier. It's not just your deferrals, it's yours plus any kind of employer matching or free money if you have that available to you. If you're 55 and just now getting started, 10% is not going to get you there. So it really does determine when you get started, how much you need to be putting aside and how long you have until you meet those goals. Now, I did see a question in the chat, and one of those questions was, how do you really determine what's going to be enough? Online, there's tons of great calculators. Mutualofamerica.com has really good calculators. There's 2 calculators that I really like to utilize. It's the nest egg calculator, basically saying how much am I going to need in retirement based on these factors, and you can input that data. And then that number, I promise you, it's going to be a little daunting, right? But if you go back to the fundamentals, like I was just mentioning, you can then do the retirement savings calculator to show how do I get to that end number that I just calculated. And you can tweak those numbers, your input. How much do you already have saved? How long until you're going to use your money? What kind of replacement of income do you need? Those calculators are really good tools to help you tailor your own needs. That's something I do want to mention specifically. Just because we're speaking in sweeping generalities here, every single person's goals are different, right? If I make the same salary as Sarah, retire the same day, live in the same neighborhood, she may, plan on traveling Europe twice a year, and I may plan on hanging at the beach reading books. So my goals are different, and therefore we need to plan accordingly.
That's good. Sarah, Marissa, anything you want to add?
No, I think Todd said it well. I will add to one thing that many people we meet with forget to think about is the cost of healthcare and the impact that's going to have on their finances and retirement. I meet with people a lot of times that say, well, I've paid off my home and I don't have a lot of the same expenses, or I will by that point, but there are other factors to consider as well when you're backing into those numbers.
Okay.
And I will jump in with Sarah mentioning the cost of healthcare. Another thing to take into consideration, especially a hot topic right now, is inflation. So if you are doing your planning for retirement and you say, I may need $60,000 to live on by the time you retire, that could very well be $75,000 or $80. So depending on the inflation and cost of living increases, those numbers, today's dollars do not equal future dollars. And that's definitely something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Related to this, Todd, during our planning meeting, you talked a little bit about those time horizons.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain what those are and share some general trends, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to piggyback on, I see another chat question talking about emergency savings and so forth. You really want to look at, again, how long do you have until you use your money? Because we cannot, as educated and as good of a strategy we put in place, we cannot predict market swings ups or down. So you really want to make sure you're sticking to the fundamentals, because everyone has short-term goals or emergency needs, maybe a year or two out. That money can't be subject to that volatility. It has to be extremely safe, extremely conservative, and fully liquid, right? Because if your car breaks down or you need a new hot water heater, well, you need that money immediately. You can't be selling at a loss if the stock market's down. You can't be waiting on 3 months to get your, some restrictions on your money or anything like that. So you have a year or two of immediate needs or short-term needs. Then you have midterm needs, which are maybe 3 to 8 years. And that may be, you're planning your, I don't know, your anniversary, your silver anniversary, or something's coming up in 5 years. Well, you might want to have different kinds of accounts, a savings account, or more moderate investments, not ultra conservative, but not ultra aggressive either. And then you have your longer term goals, which may be 7, 8, 10, 25 years down the road. Well, that you can subject to the market swings, because if you don't need that money tomorrow, you don't necessarily care what it's valued at today. A lot of times people want to buy in when things are really high and then sell when things are low. And that's the exact opposite of what you really want to be doing. So you set up buckets: short-term, mid-term, long-term, conservative, moderate, aggressive.
Okay. That's a good recap of that. Sara and Marissa, anything you want to add?
I'll just say one thing. If you hear nothing else today, please, unless it's an absolute last resort, do not borrow money from your group retirement plan. It is a bad idea. It is extremely hard to get caught back up when that happens. You need to have other sources of income for those emergency situations.
Great advice, Sara.
And I'll add one more point, and you probably, we see it a lot of people oftentimes get deterred by maybe their parents or someone that was on the verge of retiring in 2008, and they saw what they thought they would have in retirement drop by half, let's say. And it was really sad. But the question there is, why were you in those aggressive investments if you were using your money so soon? So again, they weren't necessarily investing for money that they're using short term. That was more aggressively invested for a long-term strategy.
And I guess that brings up a follow-up question, at least in my mind, then. The closer you get to retirement, those long-term goals become your short-term goals, right?
Yes.
So are you adapting your plans the closer you get to that date too, and making them more conservative as you get closer?
You are. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So those buckets, short-term, mid-term, long-term, if you retire at 65, you still have some longer-term money you may use at 85. And then the money you're using next month, next year for groceries and rent or whatever the case may be, that's going to be short-term with no risk involved. As you deplete that money, you're replacing it with the other buckets.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that's really interesting.
Charity, I'm going to jump in real quick and say,
sure.
When I'm doing financial plans for people, I get different ages. There's some people want to get started earlier, so they have a long plan in place and they can watch it go the whole time. Some people just realize right before retirement, oh no, I need to get ready for this, please help. But when I do create a plan with a person, that's something we revisit as life changes. I don't say, here's your plan, good luck, I hope it works out for you. It's something that as your life changes, we're going to check back in on what we have planned. And we're going to say, does this still work? Do you have different goals now? How much sooner are your goals you set approaching? And so all of that needs to be revisited on a regular basis. So whether you're dealing with someone at a Mutual of America or any other financial advisor, that's something you want to make sure you follow up on, and don't just do it once and hope for the best.
Oh, go ahead, Todd.
I was going to say one last thing is, if folks don't feel comfortable making those changes and gradually becoming more conservative, there are great investments in almost every retirement plan now that are target date funds that do that automatically for you. And you just set it to your retirement age. And as, let's say it's a 2040 retirement year, well, we'll invest now for a, let's say, 20-year timeline, but in 5 years, we've tweaked those investments to make sure you're becoming more conservative and appropriately investing for that time horizon.
Well, that relates to a question that came in through the chat, Todd. So I'm going to just tack it on there. How often should a person, if they're going to assess it, right? How often should they do that? Assess their sort of buckets, their short-term, long-term.
Yeah. Very, very common question. Someone in their 20s could really set it and forget it. We could put a strategy in place because you have 40 years till you use it. It's an aggressive approach, very long-term. Be in the market, taking advantage of those ups and downs, typically over a long time horizon, very good ups. If you're retiring in 10 years, maybe it is annually. If you're in retirement, maybe, to Marissa's point, maybe it's quarterly. So it does, again, really a lot of things are going to come back to fundamentals, your risk tolerance, your goals, and your time horizon.
Okay, so I'm kind of curious just about how retirement planning might differ for employees and leaders in the nonprofit sector versus who work for-profit companies. Just, as a point of reference here, do you see any differences in how long people remain in their jobs or actively employed if they're working in the nonprofit sector or the for-profit?
I would say yes, and I'm just speaking from experience here. It's not uncommon for us to see nonprofit employees working well into their 70s, 80s. We see it a lot, and I think it has less to do with being prepared for retirement than it does just having a passion for the work that they're doing. Even retirees from those sectors often go on to do consulting work because they have an expertise. They know that they're giving something to the community that they're serving. And it's very, very common in the nonprofit world for us to see them continue working well into their retirement years or to go back to some type of consulting work, not because they have to, but because they want to and they feel the work's meaningful.
It's really interesting. Marissa and Todd, do you see similar?
I do. A lot of times folks in the nonprofit world, you're not, most people aren't in it just to, become super wealthy. It's a passion for them. Therefore, it doesn't seem like work and they're able to do it longer.
Yeah. And I would just chime in and say exactly what Sara and Todd both said. When I am dealing with someone and I ask them when they want to retire, there's a difference in not-for-profit employees and for-profit. Some of them are saying the very first day that I can possibly make it, I'd like to retire. And then there are some where I tell them, you could possibly retire at 65 and be okay. And they say, I don't plan on retiring at 65. I'm going to keep going to 70, 72. So there's definitely a difference there in, attitudes and, like Sara said, their passion.
The adage of if you love what you're doing, it's not work, right?
Well, and I love, Sara, that you mentioned that, some people, pick up consulting gigs. Maybe they retire from their primary job, and then they do other, gig style jobs or other part-time work. I got to thinking about, some of the points you were making earlier, just about what is it that you want to be saving for, right? What is it that you want to do in retirement? And I love that you mentioned charitable giving, that people, need to be thinking about that too. If you want to continue to support the organizations you support, you need to build that into your plan. And I would imagine that a lot of nonprofit employees have that sort of built into their system, right? They give probably often, maybe to the organization they work for, to others that are partners. So it's a good reminder. Do you see a lot of, nonprofit employees saving with the intent to continue to give down the line? No?
Without a doubt. Yeah, I think we see a lot of our nonprofit sector turn around and give back to the agencies they came from or the museums they came from, and others. I would say even more so than the for-profit world. Would you guys agree that that's pretty much a trend we see quite often in that space?
That's really
Built
interesting.
into their DNA.
Yeah, they realize the importance of it. They, their companies or organizations' mission a lot of times can't come to fulfillment or be served without the dollars of donors.
Mhm. Oh, that I wondered about that. That's really interesting. So let's talk a little bit about challenges that may be present for women in particular when it comes to retirement planning and saving. I don't know, Marissa and Sara, and even Todd, could you elaborate on this for our participants today? Share any tips you may have?
Absolutely. This is definitely a passion of mine specifically. I mean, even if you're not a woman on this call, you know a woman that's important in your life that needs to be considering some of the challenges that women face. And it really boils down, I mean, there's many, but it really boils down to pretty much four main challenges. On average, women live longer than men. The average life expectancy for men, I think, is around 76. For women, it's, I think, just over 81. So they're spending longer in many cases in retirement than their male counterparts are. A second challenge is they often earn less than men. I mean, there's been some help here in the recent years on kind of bridging that gap. But, on average, annually, women make around $10,000 a year less than their male counterparts. So that's still something that women are facing every day. A third challenge, they're more likely to have work interruptions due to family care. It doesn't have to necessarily be childcare, but it can be on the other end where they're caring for aging parents. And for whatever reason, women are oftentimes the one to step out of the workforce to do that work. And then the fourth challenge is on average, and we see this especially with nonprofit organizations, women generally tend to invest more conservatively than men. They have a bigger fear of market fluctuation and maybe some of it's just lack of education around the topic itself, but it can certainly impact their ability to retire if they're sitting in, something like a money market fund for years and years. They're not outpacing inflation and their dollar's just not keeping up. So really, those are the main challenges that we see with women who are making an attempt to save, but it's hampered by all of those areas.
That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So
go ahead,
Marissa.
Everything that Sara said, 100%. I would say some of the less common issues that women do have is it might be an ancient type of way to think, but there are still households where, the men are in charge of the money and the women don't know anything. I think that issue is changing for the better where women are more involved, but if you do not know anything about your household's finances as a woman, and one day unexpectedly your husband is no longer there, whether you get divorced, whether he has an accident, whatever the case may be, you then have no idea what bills need to be paid, what bank accounts, what investment accounts, what anything that you have, and where to get those resources. And that's a challenge that I do see, unfortunately, quite often, where the woman just is shocked shocked that now all of a sudden she needs to learn all of this stuff. And that's where, I'm there and Sarah's there and Todd's there. We're all there to hold hands. And so you can get to that point where you are comfortable and educated and everything. But unfortunately, that problem is still out there.
So how does a woman begin to, work on that? What are ways to become educated or to get involved more, or, to start advocating? I don't know what advice you might have for the women that you have worked with before in retirement planning, and you realize they've got those roadblocks. What would you say?
I think the first thing I would suggest is to talk to some type of financial advisor or a financial planner, or anyone really in the financial industry that's there to help you. Because if you don't know what you don't know where to look. And this person is trained every day to kind of help pull those pieces of the puzzle out of you. And if you don't know where they are, that's where you start looking or asking your husband, if you do have a husband, if you live on your own, I feel like you do know this stuff already because you've been maintaining a household. But I think the first step would be to talk to someone who can kind of guide you, and you're not alone in it.
Yeah.
For
and
sure.
I would say real quick. Oh, I'm sorry, Sarah.
No, it's
I can
right.
chime in real quick.
No,
a
you
lot
go
of
ahead.
times, to Marissa's point, work with someone you're very comfortable with. Oftentimes, do I work with, let's say, a widow that they had met with their advisor and their husband for years and years. However, the advisor didn't engage the spouse. It was really kind of talking at or around the spouse. So you really want to make sure that that relationship with a professional is give and take and equal amongst you and your spouse, if that's the case. We see that quite often.
That's really interesting. Good advice.
Yeah, and preparing for, what would happen. I mean, I joke with my husband all the time that if something happened to me, I don't know that our kids would survive. But, back to the financial side of it, it's really important to know where all your important documents are located and have those conversations around, do you each have a will, and where are they? Do you each have do you have a trust? And if so, where is that? And, who's handling that if something happens? It's important to have those conversations. They're not fun conversations to have. And a lot of times, talking about money and those types of things can be uncomfortable. But it's a necessary conversation. You need to know where your bank accounts are. What are the numbers to get into them. All of those conversations are things you should be having before you really need to be having them.
That's great advice.
I can
Basically, be organized and be in the conversation, right? Be engaged in it.
Even if you don't want to be, you need to be there.
Well, thinking too about the issue of confidence, or if women tend to be more risk adverse, right, and don't invest as much, or don't invest as aggressively. Any advice for women who are joining us today who are maybe feel like they're in that same boat and nervous about the more aggressive plans?
Yeah, so hopefully all of you have some type of education at your workplace for the plan that's available to you there. If you don't, you should seek it out elsewhere, like we mentioned, because you're experts in your field. We don't expect you to be experts in financial advising or financial services. So there's no shame in asking for help in those areas, help evaluating the investments that are available to you. From those investments, what should you be selecting? Todd mentioned target retirement date funds are a great tool that help generally keep you invested the way you should be for your time horizon. They don't factor in things like risk tolerance. So if you suffer a financial loss, are you going to panic and try to get out of the market? Those are things you need to be thinking about. There are retirement calculators on our site and elsewhere that can help you target kind of what your savings goals should be. But beyond that, it's important to diversify the investments, like we mentioned, and think about hitting whatever the savings goal says it is or needs to be. If you can't meet it right now, it doesn't mean you should just give up. You should work to continue to put away more and more money every year until you hit the numbers you need to hit. And it can start with making small lifestyle changes. It's, bring your lunch to work. Instead of buying lunch every day, it's making coffee at home. I know they're not always fun things to think about, but again, really important if you at some point want to retire in a way that you're not going to have to work if you don't want to.
Great, thanks, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
So I imagine that, living through a pandemic changes the way people think about the future and retirement. And I'm wondering, Sarah, we'll start with you, if the past year's events have changed the way people think about retirement or how they plan or how they save for it.
So Todd mentioned it earlier, but if you're sticking to your fundamentals, hopefully market volatility doesn't derail your plans. We're talking, there are going to be market events that happen, things that we can't plan for, like a pandemic, like a September 11th, like a Great Depression. But if you are planning for the long term, when you're saving, then certainly you shouldn't need to shift what your objectives are on the short term. That said, we have seen, and again, just speaking from personal experience, we've seen an uptick in savings rates and group retirement plans coming through this past year. I'm not sure if it's because people are hoping to retire earlier than originally planned, or if they just realize the importance of saving for something that's an unknown. In addition to that, we're seeing an uptick in outside savings. So outside of the retirement account, building up emergency funds. I think a lot of individuals were forced to think about, what if we had to go to a one income household? Are we ready for that? If somebody were to get furloughed or laid off, are we prepared for that financial situation? So definitely seeing a trend toward that. And also just in conversations we're having with participants, a lot of focus on paying down debt right now, again, as a means to help control their financial situation a little bit better coming through the pandemic.
Todd or Marissa, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think Sarah did a great job of the fundamentals regardless of markets ups or downs, it didn't change that you have 25 years till you use your money. It didn't change what your goals are. You don't now need $80,000 if your original goal was $30,000. You're not retiring 10 years earlier because of any kind of volatility. So stick to those strategies and you'll be just fine. You'll be able to weather the storm with a plan in place.
Yeah, and I think like they both said, the fundamentals have not changed. No one has drastically changed their thought of the future. I would just say something not in the fundamentals that has changed a lot. Those goals that I'm setting up for people while I'm doing their financial plans, travel has not been on there as much. And that's just because, no one knows when it's going to be completely safe again. So people are pushing out, if they say they're going to travel every year with $1,000 a year or that as an example, they're saying don't start that travel until 2025 or 2026. So again, that's not changing any of the fundamentals. You're still having that as a goal. It's just, you may have pushed that out a little further.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. So I've got a couple other questions for you kind of to wrap us up here today. And I haven't seen any other questions come in through the chat. If I miss anything, of course, let me know, but I think we've covered all of them. So what is, and this is a question for all of you, what is your number one tip for participants when it comes to financial planning or saving for retirement? I've heard several things come up today. I imagine will end up in your tips, but let's see. Number one tip.
I would say my number one tip, and I think it's everyone's number one tip, is to start saving early. We've mentioned it a little bit before. Todd said, when you start saving, when you first start working, it's going to make a difference than someone who's already in their 50s. And so the earlier you start, the growth there is going to compound. And so you've got a bigger principal balance that's going to earn returns, which turns into a principal balance that's bigger, et cetera. But even if you save later and decide you've got a bigger chunk to save later, it's not going to add up to a smaller amount earlier. And some numbers to give an example of that is if someone who is saving from age 22 to 67, and they're only saving $100 a month, by the time they retire at 67, they're going to have around $255,000. But then if you have another person who waits 10 years later to start saving, so they're saving from 32 to 67, but they save $150 a month instead of the 100, they're not even to where the other person was. They're only at $200,000. And if you go on to, maybe you decide at age 52, you're going to start saving. You're seeing retirement ahead and you're panicking and you're like, I got to start now. And so you put $300 away a month from 52 to 67, you're only going to add up to $83,000. So you could have 255,000 or you could have 83,000 with saving a smaller amount at the beginning. And I will put some of those numbers in the chat for you guys so that you can see the difference. But that's my number one tip. Save as early as you can.
Great advice. Todd or Sara?
I would say that, yeah, that's always my tip too, is to start as early as you can. We meet with 22-year-olds who are just coming out of college and it's never on the radar. I will say though that we're seeing a shift a little bit, and I think it's probably because the parents themselves are a little more educated about what they need to do. So that's filtering down to the children. I wish they did more of this even in high school and provided this type of education, because I really think it could help to have a base of this before you go off to college or wherever else and make a bunch of mistakes financially. But I will, to piggyback on that, I would say if you have an employer plan that has some type of matching component and you're not taking advantage of that match by saving enough to maximize what your employer is going to give to you, you're making a huge mistake and should do everything you can as quickly as you can to figure out how you can make that match.
That's good advice. Todd?
Mine would come back to the saving according to the fundamentals. Let markets do what they do. Usually the big downturns like a pandemic or 08's housing crisis, September 11th, the tech bubble, savings and loans scandal, all those things are new reasons why the market took these big dips. However, the fundamentals to get through those have never changed. Those don't change. If you invest to meet your time horizon and your goals and based on your risk tolerance, you'll be just fine.
Great advice. Well, the last question I have for you today is really about resources. And I want each of you to answer this. Any recommendations for folks as they seek out additional information? What go-to resources are in your toolkit that you use for research or recommend for clients as they plan?
Yeah, and I think we're going to link to these earlier. I always encourage individuals to go to the ssa.gov site, even now, to check, regardless of how old or young you are, to check out what your work history says your Social Security amounts are going to be. There's no secret that there's some funding issues with Social Security. We hope that all of us who have paid into it will have access to it by the time we get there. But it'll give you a good idea of how you're tracking, and is definitely something you should check annually, at least to look at your earnings records and make sure those are correct there, because if there's an error, it's definitely something you're going to want to get corrected as quickly as you can. So ssa.gov, and many of you may realize that they don't mail out those statements as regularly as they used to. I think it's, Marissa, you might know better, but I think it's every year, your age you're ending in 5, they now send them out, 55, 65, and they start sending them out a little closer to retirement as well. But we're not getting those pushed to us any longer. So definitely a resource you want to go seek out to take a look at that. So that's my one main resource I direct people to.
And I would jump in on that since you said I may know better. I don't know if Social Security is now just sending out paper statements kind of rogue. I think you have to go onto the Social Security site that's in the chat here and sign up for an account, which, you know, is super secure. They give you a whole bunch of pins and passcodes and stuff like that. And so then you can check that information online at any point in time. And once you do, I feel like they've kind of gone all electronic, but I know there are people that don't do electronic. So there's a way to make it not electronic, but I think they've really backed down on the paper mailings.
That's great. Other resources?
Charity, you had referenced it earlier when we had provided a list. mymoney.gov is a really good resource. I
think we did mention it earlier where our retirement calculators are available on the Mutual of America website. There are quite a few there. There are also areas where, you know, I was going over terms earlier and giving you a super high level definition of them, but we have a glossary on there. So you could check out the glossary if you want to make sure you know what something means. But in terms of not specific websites, but I think a tip and a resource is to make sure that you have your estate planning documents up to date, or if you even have them. Sara touched on it a little bit earlier, and I think it goes with the you don't know what you don't know, so you don't know who to ask and you don't know what you should have. There are 5 key documents that people should have when planning for life, not just retirement. And there's a durable power of attorney. There are advanced medical directives, which also can be called a living will. There is your will, so that's going to let everyone know what you want to happen to all of your assets when you pass away, and a testamentary letter or a letter of instruction. It's called a couple different things. That's something to have. And there's also one that not everyone has to have, but it's important if it is in your scenario of life, is a living trust. So it's not necessary, but there are circumstances for certain people where it does play a part. And so not just getting all of those documents setting up, but making sure they're up to date, that you have who your executors in your wills, that's who you want it to be, your beneficiaries, those are correct. As time goes on, make sure that those are up to date. And also that you know where they are. Going back to women may not know some of that information and men may not know some of that information. That's not a gender specific thing, but it's important that you know, and maybe you let your kids know if it comes to that point where they may be the ones taking charge of things.
Great advice. I did see a question come in through the chat. And so I want to make sure we answer it. And then we do need to wrap up because we're about at an hour here and I want to let folks get on with their day. Is it better to pay off debt first before saving? That's a good question. I'm sure we all have some debt.
I would say first piece of saving is that emergency fund. You've got to have that set up to cover anything first, because if you go ahead and pay off your debt before that's set up and then an emergency happens, what are you going to do? You're going to put yourself in more debt. So having that emergency fund first, and then make sure you're taking advantage of all of your available resources. If you have an employer sponsored plan that has a match, make sure that you're saving that portion. So you're taking advantage of that free money that's available to you. And then I would take a look at interest rates. If your debt is 0% interest rate or something super, super low, you may not be inclined to pay that off versus making a Roth IRA contribution. So everyone's circumstance, again, is going to be specific to them. But in general, I would say have an emergency fund set up, take advantage of any of the free benefits that you may have from your employer, and then take a look at the debt and analyze at that point which one's better. And if you don't know, you can ask someone for help.
Great. Well, we're at time. I did want to just mention that I'm sure Sara and Marissa and Todd would be happy to chat with anybody who wanted to ask questions offline. So maybe drop your email addresses into the chat here before we go. And then, thanks for being, open with us today about what you see and sharing a lot of great advice. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. We will share a recording, so you can always refer back to this. I know some of you may be planning to share this information with employees, and that's great. Feel free to do that. We'll get that recording to you probably next week with the reminder for next week's session. So I guess thanks everybody once again. Have a great rest of your day and week, and we'll catch you next week for our final lunchtime chat.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Charity.
Thank you.